Now, I mentioned in the introduction that the Hebrew word for proverb is the same word that's translated parable in the rest of the Bible. Let's go ahead and look at that, our verse that we opened with in Proverbs chapter 1, verses 5 and 6. A wise man will hear and will increase learning, and a man of understanding shall attain unto wise counsels. To understand a proverb and the interpretation. Now, if we go ahead and look at the Strong's number, Strong's Concordance is a book that was put together to put numbers to each of these words so that we can look up these words easily and find out what the original manuscripts said of them, right? So in Proverbs chapter 1, verse 6, we have this word, have the word proverb. And if we come over here, we'll see if we click on the number that 19 times it's translated proverb, but 18 times it's translated parable. One time byword and another time like. Now, if I go ahead and click on this, there's a couple of verses in here that are very significant about this because this is the same word for proverb. We read in Psalm 49, verse 4, I will incline mine ear to a parable. I will open my dark saying upon the harp. There is that phrase of dark sayings, right, that we read about in Proverbs. And Psalm 78, verse 2 also, I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings of old. So parables are this means of containing mystery. We can't just look at a parable. You can't look at any parable in the Bible and try to uh, glean physical, literal truths from them. You can, of course, but the purpose of the parable is to show something that has a spiritual character to it. You can't look at the book of Proverbs and only take what's there at face value. There must be spiritual truths behind the book itself. So let's go ahead and um, start with our subject text in chapter 27, verse 17. Iron sharpens iron. So a man sharpeneth the countenance of his friend. Now we're going to start at the end of this verse. It's very easy to be convinced, right, that this verse is talking about two or more Christian friends building one another up in the faith and so on, getting together for Bible study, prayer, fellowship. All of these things are obviously part of the Christian experience and very wholesome things that we do. I mean, here, after all, it does say that a man is plainly sharpening the countenance of his friend. So the immediate conclusion that we arrive is that this is a man and a man. And like I said, we can't just take a proverb at its face value. There must be some underlying truth to it. And the only way we can find that out is by allowing the Bible to define its terms. Now, the words that are used here are surprisingly similar to an encounter that God had with Moses. Okay, we turn to Exodus chapter 33. And in verse 11, we read these words, And the Lord spake unto Moses face to face, as a man speaketh unto his friend. Now, notice that right there. The Lord speaks unto Moses face to face as a man. So, God here is comparing himself to a man. The Lord is being likened to a man speaking to his friend face to face. It's the exact same thing over here in Proverbs chapter 27. A man sharpeneth, that's the only different word here, sharpeneth the countenance of his friend. Countenance is obviously the word for face. And we also see the usage of the word face here in Exodus 33. Now, does this mean that God sharpened the face of Moses? Well, what does that even mean, to sharpen someone's face? For now, however, it does confirm that God speaks face to face with men whom he calls his friends. And we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at a bunch of passages that talk about that. It's not just Moses, okay, that he spoke with face to face, but all of the elect he speaks face to face with. We'll turn to, let's see, Second Chronicles chapter 20. Speaking of Abraham, in fact, verse 7. Second Chronicles 20, verse 7. Art not thou our God who did drive out the inhabitants of this land before thy people Israel and gave it to the seed of Abraham, thy friend, forever? Okay, so he's speaking here of the seed of Abraham. Abraham as well, but the whole seed of Abraham. And here he is called the friend of God forever. Okay, James is likewise talking about Abraham over here in chapter 2 in verse 23. The scripture was fulfilled, which saith, Abraham believed God, and it was imputed unto him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. Okay, very clear. Very clear that Abraham twice is called the friend of God. Now, that does not exclude all of the rest of God's people. We read in John chapter 15 the words of Christ himself in the Gospel of John, chapter 15, verses 13, 14, and 15. Well, he says in verse 12, this is my commandment that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. Okay, this is not talking about some noble thing that a human being does for another human being, although Jesus was a human being. He's speaking of himself. He's foretelling his going to the cross for his friends. And he says that you are my friends if you do whatsoever I command you. Henceforth I call you not servants, for the servant knoweth not what his Lord is doing. But I have called you friends. For all things that I have heard of my Father, I have made known unto you. My friend, you and I, as true believers, are friends of the living God. You see, when a person becomes saved, we are no longer enemies. That's how we start out with God. That is such a fact that many people do not consider or know, that we start out before being regenerated, before being born from above as enemies of God. But once we experience the new birth, we then become friends with God forever. In John chapter 3, John the Baptist gets his words in here as well. John chapter 3, verses 28 and 29. We read, now he is being asked, who are you? Who are you? You know, the people were waiting, the people in Israel were waiting for the coming Messiah. They thought maybe John was the one, given his behavior, the things that he was saying, the way he was conducting himself, and so forth. He was really hard on the people and preaching the gospel about one that was coming after him. So he says, you bear witness, you yourselves bear me witness that I said, I am not the Christ. So he told them plainly, I am not the one you're seeking, but that I am sent before him. He that has the bride is the bridegroom, but the friend of the bridegroom is Christ. The friend of the bridegroom, which standeth and heareth him, rejoices greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. This my joy, therefore, is fulfilled. Now, the bride is the church, the eternal church, of whom Christ is married to. He is the bridegroom, and John the Baptist is the friend of the bridegroom. Now, some of these are obvious, direct references to who the friend is of God, because he states it very, very plainly, but some references are not so direct. For example, we'll look at Song of Solomon, for example. In chapter 5, Song of Solomon is another perfect example of a allegorical book. Okay, this book is all mostly, if not all of it, parables and proverbs. We're not to understand this book on purely just a physical, literal interpretation. The Song of Solomon was written by Solomon, who also wrote Proverbs. So you have to think there that he was, inspired by God to write this very parabolic language, because he also wrote Ecclesiastes, which can be a very difficult book towards the last half of that writing. We read in Song of Solomon, chapter 5, verse 16, his mouth is most sweet. This is the bride of Christ speaking, although she's referred to as the Shunammite woman in this book. He is altogether lovely. This is my beloved, and this is my friend, O daughters of Jerusalem. So in this case, the bride of Christ is speaking, calling Jesus our friend. Now, if we were to go over to Proverbs 27, where our subject text is, in this very chapter, we read in verse 6, faithful are the wounds of a friend. Now, who is the friend here? This is speaking of Christ as well, okay? This is a parable. This is not speaking about my friend, my neighbor, a family member who takes wounds for me, okay? This is speaking of eternal God, and we can prove this by going to Isaiah chapter 53. Faithful are the wounds of a friend. In that famous chapter, which speaks of Christ most directly, we read in verse 4, surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. Okay, Christ was smitten of God the Father, but he was wounded for our transgressions. Okay, just like it says over here, as a friend. Faithful are the wounds of a friend. Jesus is the friend here. He was the one that was wounded for our transgressions in Isaiah 53, verse 5. It goes on. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him. And with his stripes, we are healed. We are healed of our sin. Now, doesn't the Bible say that no man has seen the face of God and lived? How is Moses able to speak with God face to face? We'll look at that in the next video.